is that Yomi is Avodah Zarah Daf Mem Tes, Avodah Zarah 49. Or Hashem, we're going to start on the bottom of Mem Ches on the base, 4 lines from the bottom. Is that Yomi is dedicated for Shemir for the Chayalim, Matzah for the Shminim and Yeshua for Am Yisrael and the Seis Tzara. Daf Yomi tells us that Rabbi Yossi says in our Mishnah, you're not allowed to plant vegetables under an Asherah tree because the nevaya, the foliage, will fertilize it, and so we'll combine and make it prohibited because you're getting benefit from the foliage of the Asherah tree. But the rabbi said this. The Gemara says this must mean that Rabbi Yossi is in a position that if two things impact, one is permitted, one is prohibited. Zev and Zegorim, two things are impacting it, and he must say it's prohibited. Gemara says, but there's a contradiction to this because earlier we learned in the Mishnah that Rabbi Yossi says that you can throw something into the wind and idle, and we're not worried about fertilizing it. So he means earlier he says Zev Zegorim is mutter. So the Gemara says no, that was because that thing that you ground up was being destroyed, but here it's not being destroyed. So the Gemara now says, does Rabbi Yossi really say Zev Zegorim is also? Does he really say that? 4 lines to the bottom of 48b, V'savar Rabbi Yosef's Zev Zegorim is also. Is he really of that opinion? V'tanam, but then we learned in a mission Orla, Rabbi Yossi Omer notin yichorsho Orla, that you're allowed to take a branch of an Orla tree the first 3 years in which it's planted, and you're allowed to plant it because the prohibition is only on the fruit. They notin egos Orla. You can't take a nut or a fruit of an Orla tree. You're not allowed to plant it pre, because it is a fruit, and so therefore it's not allowed to be planted. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, Mother Rabbi Yossi would admit, Shem Nata v'Hivrech v'Hirkiv, Mutter. Rabbi Yossi would admit that if you combined it with something else, if you did grafting or you branched it onto something else, then it would be permitted because we're going to say that was combining with something that was permitted, and so thereby it's permitted. So we see from that position that he's at the position that Zev Zegorim is mutter. So hold on 1 second. So basically we see from here that since it's combining with the ground or some other factor, if you graft it onto the nut tree, then it's going to be permitted because it must be from here that Rabbi Yossi says Zev Zegorim is permitted. So V'tayin Amiyachin, indeed we have this Moli Rabbi Yossi Shem Nata, and if you planted the nut tree and combined with the ground, the Hivrech v'Hirkiv mutter, or if you graft it onto it, it will be permitted because it's Zev Zegorim. Rabbi Yossi ben Shari Surim Avodas coming. He would say by idolatry, he's going to be strict. But by the case of the tree, the oil will be permitted. The Gemara says, but he doesn't draw us through the distinction. Vatanya Sada, we have a brisa that says Sada Shenistabla, but Zev Avodas Kochavim. We have a different source which said if you have a field that was fertilized with the manure of idolatry, or if you have a cow that was fattened with the food of idolatry, Tanicha, the one brisa says Sada Tizara, Paratishach. One says that you can still sow the field and the cow you could still slaughter, which means Zev Zegorim is permitted because it is two factors involved. The Tanya Idach, Sada, Tibor, Upara, Tirza, and the other source says that you have to let the field lie fallow and the cow die. So we see from here that one is saying Zev Zegorim is prohibited. So who's the one who says that? Ma'alav Rabbi Yossi Rabbanan. It must be that the one who says it's prohibited is Rabbi Yossi, the one who says it's permitted the Rabbanan. The Gemara says no. Rabbi Yossi could still say Zev Zegorim is going to be in general. He could still say it's permitted. So isn't the one that's saying that it's prohibited? That must be that Surabanan, and the one who's saying it's permitted is Rabbi Yossi. Mara says no. How my love? How Rabbi Yossi Rabban? No. The Gemara says the one that's saying that it's permitted there is the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan. The Gemara says, where do we say that it's? Hold on 1 second. So it says this is a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan. Hi, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanan. Where do they argue about this? Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan disor by the case of leaven or sourdough or yeast that fermented, where one was the sourdough of truma and one was from non-truma. The Tanan we learned in Psachim and in Orwa Saor Shalchulin Vishal Truma. Let's say you put sourdough, that's chulin dough, and also truma dough into a mixture. Shenafo tocha isa fell into the dough. Well, bezekadei chametz. Neither one had sufficient to ferment, and it's darful v'chemtzu, and then they combined together and they fermented. Rabbi Eliezer Omer acharon anibah. Rabbi Eliezer says, I follow only the latter one. That even, whether it fell in the beginning or in the end, that each one, unless the truma is sufficient on its own to ferment, it's not prohibited. So Rabbanan clearly are saying Zev Zegorim is going to be mutter. When does Rabbi Eliezer say that it is permitted? If he removed the prohibited one, but if he didn't remove the prohibited one, aser. So we're going to say then under those circumstances, it's going to be prohibited. So it must be that he's in the position Zev Zegorim is prohibited. So we see from here where Rabbi Eliezer is saying Zev Zegorim is prohibited, and the Chachamim are of the position in this case that Zev Zegorim is going to be permitted because each one needs sufficient on its own to make the dough prohibited. Otherwise, it's going to be permitted. So Gemara says, no, that's not proof that Rabbi Eliezer's position Zev Zegorim is prohibited. Remind the time of Rabbi Eliezer get Abaye. How do we know that the reason of Rabbi Eliezer is like Abaye? Dilma time into Rabbi Eliezer. Maybe the reason why Rabbi Eliezer says it's prohibited. Mishum da'achar acharon anybody. He just follows the last one. It has nothing to do with Zev Zegorim. If it finishes, if the last one finishes, it's prohibited, and if the last one that finishes is permitted, it's permitted. So the Gemara says, okay, so it must be that there's a different, whether or not you remove them, it must be that Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan ate it. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan of wood. The Tanan, not only meant ate him. So let's say you had the wood from an Asherah tree, which you removed. Asur ba'ana. So such wood is going to be prohibited to have benefit from. Hisik ba'as atanur chadash. So let's say you use this wood and you used it to cement really a new oven. Utat. So since the oven became cemented, basically finished off from the Asherah tree, you're going to have to destroy it. If it will be a yashan, if it will be an old oven, Yutzan, you have to wait for the fire to cool down. And if you bake bread in it, asur bahana, then you can't have any benefit from such bread. If that bread became mixed up with others, there's some girsa issues here to see whether the acherim came mixed up with others to what degree. But we say kul and asur bahana, they're all prohibited. Rabbi Eliezer says no, just take the amount that was baked in the oven and throw that into the sea. And the sages rejected this. So the sages said that you cannot, that you can't do that for idolatry. You can't do that thing of poda. But we see from here that Rabbi Eliezer is of the position that where the wood from the Asherah tree goes into the oven, that it's going to be, that the sages say it's prohibited. And Rabbi Eliezer says it's going to be, you can take a little part out and throw it into the oven. So Rabbi Eliezer says, so we see from this case over here, hold on 1 second. You see from here, there are others of the position that Zev Zegorim is going to be prohibited. So because he says that you can't benefit from it. So the Gemara says, but the Rabbanan of that case, who are they? The Rabbanan who argue and say Zev Zegorim is permitted, who are the ones who say it? If Rebbe Elazar's the source for Zev Zegorim is prohibited, who are the Rabbanan who say it's prohibited? Where it says Rabbanan the Pligo Rebbe the Rebbe Elazar Manin, who are the ones who argue and say it's permitted. Ilema Rabbanan the Eitzim. If you want to say, it's the Rabbanan of this case of the wood, they're even more strict. They don't even allow you to redeem it at all. So obviously, they're not the ones who say it's permitted. If you want to say it's the rabbis in the case of the Saor who say that in the case of the sourdough where it falls into the mixture, that it's going to be that if you want to say it's the rabbis of Saor who argue with Rebbe Lezer, and they say that the dough is permitted because Zev Zegorim is permitted. Amor deshamas rabbanin de mekili b'saor b'avot chavim mekili. That's just a case that they're lenient by the sourdough, but I don't know they're lenient also by idolatry. So we say no, that the one who is going to be strict is the brisa that allows you to benefit from the idolatry is the position of Rabbi Yossi, who says Zev Zegorim is permitted. And the one who's strict there is the Rabbanan. But what about the fact that in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi is saying that Zev Zegorim seems to be saying Zev Zegorim is prohibited? The Gemara says no, that Rabbi Yossi is not really Rabbi Yossi's position. The Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi explaining the rabbi's position and challenging it. Rabbi Yossi with Divrayim to Rabbanan Amar Lahu. He says to them with Didi, he says, Rabbi Yossi saying, I don't even understand your position. With Didi, Zev Zegorim is mutter. I say that two things are causing it is permitted. But the Dayachud Amrisi Zev Zegorim is answer, but according to you, say it's prohibited. Odaway mihas, at least admit to me, Af Yerakos be most like Shalom. At least admit to me, if you say it's prohibited, you should admit to me about the case of that the rain, that the vegetables in the winter are going to should be prohibited because it's getting the foliage. And so since you say Zev Zegorim is prohibited, that case should be prohibited. For Rabbanan, they respond, and they respond, no, that the foliage itself is helping, but the net result of the tree being underneath the Asherah tree means that it's not a net gain. And so therefore, we rule that the law is like Rabbi Yossi, that Zev Zegorim is actually permitted, and this is an important factor. But say poskim, when Zev Zegorim is permitted is when what's the reason why Zev Zegorim works? Because of the principles of nullification, that it's nullified because there's two factors there, and the prohibitive factor is nullified. But in a situation like where it's not nullified, like for example, chametz, then we're going to say, according to everyone, some say, even Rabbi Yossi would say Zev Zegorim is prohibited. That's where the stringency comes from of people say you have to buy milk before Pesach. Why do you have to buy the milk before Pesach? I have the concern that maybe if you drink milk that was milked on Pesach, then that milk combined with the cow eating chametz, perhaps. And so therefore the chametz is contributing to the milk. So therefore, some say Zev Zegorim so since you say Zev Zegorim would never be nullified in that case because it's chametz on Pesach, then you can have a problem. It seems to me like that's a very, very big stringency because you have to assume that the milk in the supermarket today was milked on the first or second day of Yom Tov and already got to the supermarket. I mean, I can understand if you're buying from a farmer, but even then, why is the cow eating chametz? I thought I guess they were eating like this grain mixture. Fine. Okay. Anyway, it's just a small discussion. So, Hahu Ginta, there were
benefiting from the chametz.
Well, that the right, because the chametz, or you're even eating it perhaps, but benefiting it because the chametz contributed to making of the milk in the cow. So the Gemara says, Ahu Ginta, there was a gardener who used some fertilizer of idolatry. Shoach Rav Amram Kamed Rav Yosef. So Rav Amram sent a message in front of Rav Yosef. Amarei Hachiyam Rav Yehuda Mashmo Hachak Rav Yosef. It was like Rav Yosef says Zev Zagorim is permitted, so therefore he says it's permitted. So now the Gemara says, not says the Mishnah on the top of Mem Testament base, not only Mena Eitzim. Once he took from the Asherah tree wood, Asurin Ba'ana, then you're not going to be allowed to get any benefit from that wood because it's Asherah wood. Hasik Ba'anis Atan, or let's say you use this wood to fuel an oven, Im Chadash, if it's a new oven, Utats, you have to break it because the assumption is that the first time an oven is used, the wood finishes it off. So if it's a new oven, you have to break it because the whole oven was made by the Asherah wood. If it's an old oven, then you have to wait for that fuel to disappear. Afa boas apas, if you bake bread with it, asura ba'ana. You're not going to be allowed to benefit from it. Why? Because according to this position, Zev Zagorim is prohibited, meaning to say, because it was finished through prohibited and permitted, meaning to say, if it was a new oven, the oven is what caused the prohibition. And so therefore, and so therefore it's going to be prohibited. And if it's an old oven, the oven is not the problem, but the wood is going to be the problem, and therefore it's going to be prohibited. So the Gemara says, this arva b'acheros, let's say you take out that, the Mishnah says you take out that bread and you mix it up with others, kul and asuris b'ana, they're all going to be prohibited. No, it's not all prohibited, just take the extra part and throw it into this thing. They say, no, you can't do this concept of redemption by idolatry. Not only mena kirkor, let's say you took from the Asherah tree a pick or a piece of wood, asur ba'ana, you can't benefit. Argbos a beged, you wove a garment, asur ba'ana, then that garment will become prohibited to have any benefit from it. This Arif Ba'acher, let's say that garment became mixed up with other garments, Ba'acher and others of others, Kul and Asur B'ana, it's all going to be prohibited, even though it's so attenuated. No, you throw it into the sea. There's no redemption. We need both the case of the bread and also the case of the weaving of the garments. If we only had a case of the bread, we would say, that's why Rabbi Eliezer says his position that you can redeem it, a portion and throw it into the sea, Mishim the Be'ina, the Kagamra Pas, because when the bread was finished, that's when the prohibition finished. In the case of the oven, which was old, of Okirkor, but the pick, the Isole Sure, the pick, which the Isole Sure B'nei, where the garment is still in existence, maybe we would admit to the rabbis, you can't redeem it. He asked me in Kirkor, and if he only just told us the case of the pick, and that's what the rabbis say that you can't redeem it. Avopas, maybe agree with Rebbe Lezer, you could throw an element into the Mamelach. So it's true in both cases. That you could throw a portion into the sea. So it was like Rebbe Lezer. Okay, when do we say you could throw a portion into the sea by bread? But if you wine got mixed up into a barrel, you can't do it. Low. So what he says, even chavis would be permitted. What's the reason for wine? Because the wine is still in existence. It's be'ain. It's still right there. So that's why he says that even chavis is. That's why Rav Abba says the chavis would not be permitted. Who gavra this? So there's a guy who's v'yayin nesach. It's prohibited wine became mixed up with the vinegar. Asla kamei derav chista. He came in front of Rav. His prohibited wine became mixed up with his kosher wine. With his kosher wine. Also coming to Rav Chista, he said, you could sell all your wine. Just take out the amount of 4 zuz from that and throw it into the river, and you'll be okay. So now we say, how do you nullify this Asherah tree? Kirsame, that the idolater has to do this because the Jew cannot nullify it. So what does the idolater have to do? He has to remove some splinters from the tree to burn them. The ziraid, or he has to remove some moist parts of the tree. Not only metamakal or shavet rafilu, if he just removes like a stick or a branch or a leaf, harezu betela, it's going to be nullified. Shifa with tzarcha, if he whittled it down for the needs of the Asherah tree to make it beautiful, asura, that is going to be prohibited. Shalola tzarcha muteris. So now it said oson shafan, those wood chips that we went to the Mishnah that an idolater who whittled down the Asherah tree for its own purposes, then the tree is not nullified. So what about the whittlings that he did down, the shavings? Osa shafin matealein. What's their law? Pligi barav Rav Chia, Rafuna barav Chia barav Chadam asur and Chadam mutar. One says it's prohibited, one says it's permitted. Tanya command amar mutar, and so we have a price like the one that says it's permitted. The Tanya ovik kochavim sheshifa ovodis kochavim utzarcho. So he whittles down the tree for its own need. The hivit shafam mutar, and then since it wasn't for idolatry, because he's shaving it down for the tree, not for the idolatry, so then the tree and the shavings are permitted. With Sarchaba, for the idolatry, he has to, the tree is prohibited, Ushfaya mutar, and the shavings are permitted. But if the Jew did it, the Jew can't nullify it, so if the Jew did it, everything remains prohibited. Idolatry that broke. Rav Amar you need to nullify each and every splinter from it. Shmuel says, idolatry will only be nullified in the typical manner in which it grows. But since it broke on its own, he doesn't need to nullify it because it's nullified on its own. As we saw the argument earlier, the person will say, listen, we saw this back on Mem Aleph. He say, this idolatry can't even save itself. It's going to save me. So therefore, he says, if the idolatry broke, Rav says you need to nullify. Shmuel says, Eina Betela. Rashi's version of it is Eina Avodas Kom Tzricho Vata Al Kshiderach Kedei Lasa. Only you don't need to nullify it unless it was in the normal ladder. The Gemara says Adarabba. No, I skipped on. It says Eina Avodas Kochavim. Shmuel says Avodas Kochavim Eina Betela Al Derech Kedei Lasa. It's only nullified if it's in the normal way of growth. Adarabba Derech Kedei Lasa. If it's in the normal way of growth, that statement doesn't make sense. So it means, like I just said, you only need to nullify it if it was in the normal way of growth. Then you need to nullify it. But in this case, where it broke on its own, you don't need to nullify it. Maybe what's the source of this argument? Do the idolaters worship the broken pieces? One says they do, one says they don't. No, everybody says they worship it. They're arguing about the broken of the broken. Marasavar Shivrei Shvar Mutar, and Marasavar Shivrei Shvar Masur, and Marasavar Shivrei Shvar Mutar. One says prohibited, one says permitted. The body same as the Koyama Shivrei Shvar Mutar. Everybody says it's permitted. Here we're talking about the idolatry of that was broken apart. And a non-worker can know how to easily reassemble. Marasavar Hedjo, giving the Hedjo. Since the hedgehog can easily reassemble, it's not nullified. Says it only nullifies the way it grows, but if it's not the typical way it grows and it broke, you don't even need to nullify it. So that's that chapter. Now. Tomorrow we'll continue with the fourth chapter. Okay. Yeah, Shikoach, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.